Hey everybody, welcome to the final week of our NaNoWriMo discussion in which we'll be talking about the actual drafting process. We still have 1 week left after this. Hold your horses, hold your horses, everybody. I'm joined by Emily Vandervent, my amazing guest host and author coach extraordinaire. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Vincent. How are you?
Pretty good. It's a nice day. It's a nice hot day, but it's a good one anyway.
Yeah.
And really, honestly, if you're at this point in the writing process, which this is titled Wrapping It Up, so you're at the end of drafting, it doesn't really matter the weather. You got to get it done, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first off, in terms of how that goes for authors, and something that's very important to think about as you near the end game, if you've watched our past live streams on this topic, you understand that there's a lot that goes into the drafting process, whether you're doing nonfiction or a fiction book. So the question that kind of lingers and remains for those of you who are nearing the end is, how do you navigate self-imposed deadlines? Should you implement them if you don't already have external ones? Which I would argue it's kind of rare for authors who are even going traditional publishing route to already have that lined up as they're drafting like the basic manuscript, especially first-time authors. So typically during the drafting process itself, whether you're publishing traditionally, self-publishing, something in between, a small indie press, usually you're kind of on your own at this point in the process as far as that goes. So should you put a deadline on yourself? I'm in the camp that you should. I'm a deadline writer. That's my style. I see the deadline, and whether or not I'm patterned or habitual or whatever, getting to that point, I work really hard, at least by the end, procrastinating to meet that deadline. And it usually works out for me. Deadlines are something that motivate me. Now, I'm not even saying that that's a sort of mindset that's going to work for you or for all authors in general. But I do think even if you're not wired that way, even if you are habitual and you're fine with pacing yourself and you're very patterned in how you write, and this is not a problem for you, I still think you should set deadlines. And here's why. It's because you're never really satisfied or never really done with your book. That's how a lot of authors, and I would argue that probably all authors, if not like 99% or whatever the statistic might be, feel as they're writing their book, even when it's done, even when it's printed. If you have a physical copy and you're seeing that in your hands, you're proud of it, hopefully. You know, it's amazing that it's done. There's a lot that you love about it. It's cleaner than it's ever looked, hopefully. But you still see, oh man, in that one chapter, I could have done this and it would have made it that much better. And if you don't set a deadline, that's going to keep happening during your writing and editing process. If you don't set deadlines in drafting, you might not ever really get to the editing process, but at least in a way that propels you forward. So my take is set a deadline. You can adjust it as you need be, but try and set a strict or kept to deadline, even if you do adjust it by, a week or by however much you might need to. What are your thoughts on this one, Emily, for authors who are wrapping up drafting?
Yeah, I'm very much in the same camp as you, Vincent. Even if you don't have a external deadline that someone else is holding you to, I personally think it's still really important to put that deadline on yourself. If they need to be pushed back or if they need to be changed, you can always do that. But I think it's far easier to write and to do all those other book related things when you have these goals to reach toward and these deadlines looming over you. I think it just also sort of helps you make writing a priority, because a million different things, we know as we go through life, a million different things pop up here and there, and everything sort of vies for your attention. But if you have these goals in place, if you have these deadlines that you're working toward, you can sort of try to filter through the distractions and know where you're going and what you're working for.
True. And, something that's sort of been a theme as we've talked over the past couple weeks of live stream in terms of styles of writing and you're a more patterned habitual writer than I am, even if, we don't fit perfectly into those boxes. And to still hear that from your camp, from your style of writer, talking about how that deadline's important is easy to picture, because then you're able to pace out how you're getting it done towards that deadline. You're able to plan out ahead and create a writing plan around that. And if you don't have an endpoint, if you don't have a deadline, then you're just going to keep kind of rolling forward or rolling, into editing before you should, or something drafting might not exactly finish up in the clearest way. So that kind of leads to our next question is, how do you, once you've set a deadline as an author, how do you finish up or fix up your draft, your manuscript, your first draft, close to that deadline that you've set? And this can apply, honestly, further along in the process, too, is how do you just finish up editing or finish up an edit close to a deadline? How does somebody, as an author and a writer, meet a deadline, whether it's self-imposed or otherwise? Emily, do you have any strategies that have been helpful to you in terms of getting that final push?
Yeah. So I'll preface by saying, I always err on the side of, find what motivates and works for you. Because, I could give you advice, but you might try it and be like, this is really not how I function. So, in all of this, take anything that we say with a grain of salt, because, it's from our own experiences, and our experiences might not be the same as yours. We might write different than you. But, all that said, for me, it's usually, some sort of carbonation. Combination.
I thought you were about to say carbon dating. I was like, oh, okay, wow, this is getting very advanced.
Usually some sort of combination of carving out the time to write and then saying no to things that distract me from writing or doing whatever book related things that I need to do. Just really holding tight to my calendar and what I give my attention to, because I said, a million different things will pop out of the woodwork and suddenly your attention's just all over the place. But my friends and family, for example, they know that I am just completely out of commission the week before a deadline, and especially the weekend before a deadline, because that's sort of my time where it's untouched and I can just zero in on what I'm writing. I'm more episodic, who tries to be habitual, like we talked about before. Larger chunks of time where I can just sort of disconnect and zero in is really how I'm most productive. So I definitely need that the week before and the weekend of before a deadline. But I'd also say give yourself not as you're writing, but give yourself incentives. It should theoretically be incentive enough that you would meet those goals, and that you're finishing your draft or finishing your visions or finalizing your cover or whatever it is. But for me, sometimes with the distractions and everything that, sometimes that isn't necessarily enough, even though it should be. So even just simple small things when I finally finish this draft, maybe I'll buy this book that I've been wanting to buy, or maybe I'll go get a coffee to celebrate, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be large, but just something that sort of sweetens the deal a little bit, and gives you some sort of additional reward or additional thing to work through, which I find really helpful to me, especially if I'm just super unmotivated, or if whatever I'm working on, the words just aren't coming out right, or the edits are taking forever, or whatever that looks like. Just having that little extra something often sort of kicks me to the finish line when I need it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, because I'm thinking about different points in my writing process and sort of arc that you go on as a writer. You want the sort of rush of meeting a goal and having a reward that's maybe beyond even just the fact that, oh my gosh, I remember finishing my first draft. It was amazing. It was this momentous occasion. Cap it off, treat yourself once you're at that point. But that being said, you actually do really have to earn it close to that deadline. And I know for a lot of writers, it's not necessarily going to be your most healthy writing stretch. We talked, I think it was last week, about, no, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, about keeping pace and, balancing mental health and balancing general health with the actual act of being a disciplined writer and getting your stuff done. And more so than any other time in your drafting process, this is the moment where the health side kind of goes out the window. And that's why a deadline's tough. It's rough. It's not sweet or easy, and you really do earn those kind of momentous rewards at the end, whatever they might be, whatever incentive, even if it is just finishing the draft. It is earned, and deadlines are very hard. And I think, especially, even if you are a habitual writer, there's something about the fact that this is going to be done by this time that makes you want to work on it more and makes you want to put in that last little bit before I move on to this next phase in the process where I'm thinking about things differently. There's something to it in terms of having a lot of dedicated time, being out of commission for other aspects of your life, and really saying in this moment, hey, I am choosing my book for this week, for these 2 weeks. I am really actively saying this is what it takes for me to become an author, and this is what it takes for my book to be finished in its current form, its first draft form. It's a sacrifice, and this is the moment. The deadline is the moment where your sacrifice is being asked for, and you have to be prepared for that and actually make it a moment and an event that's in your mind. Otherwise, it's petered out and it doesn't really close. This part of the process doesn't finish off. So I agree. I mean, pushing yourself and then rewarding yourself are really important in this moment. And I don't really know I don't know how healthy it is. I don't know exactly the best ways to deal with that. But I think that's the way I tackled it, and I am glad I did. It's one of the things I do not regret. How I handled deadlines, I think it was worthwhile to push myself at that point. Yeah, do you have anything else to add in terms of this?
No, I don't think so. I think we kind
All
of
right.
covered the gamut on that one.
Awesome. Well, I think something that in terms of finishing up close to deadline, maybe not right at the deadline, I would hope so, but in terms of you're getting closer to whatever deadline you set, whatever moment you're going to be done with your first draft. And if for the authors who, put caution to the wind and don't have a deadline, even if you are feeling that you're close to your draft, something that you have to consider is filler chapters. And this is especially becomes important later on, even beyond drafting, but it's something that first pops into your head as you're getting closer to being done with drafting. Are they okay? I mean, what exactly is a filler chapter, Emily? And is it okay to write one? And how would you go about it if you were going to do that?
Yeah. So basically, a filler chapter is where you just have extra things going on. It doesn't necessarily or super directly advance the plot, but it has other components sort of wrapped up into it. So in like the sense of like, is a filler chapter okay? My kind of answer is like a yes, but so like, yes, filler chapters are okay. And often a lot of books will have filler chapters, and they might not necessarily directly advance the plot, but they have to do something. They can just like be in there to like increase your word count. That's not like a strong enough reason to throw a filler chapter in my opinion. Because then it's just kind of like pointless, empty words at that point. I always err on the side of like a filler chapter has to do something. So it has to like provide additional backstory, or it has to like give more screen time to like secondary characters that like maybe for this book aren't important, but maybe for like the next book in the series, if it's a series, will be important. So they have more screen time. You get to know them a little bit better. Or maybe it just sort of like fleshes out the world a little bit more. If it does one of those things or like some other element in story, it helps like advance, even if it's not like the whole narrative. Then yeah, it's honestly those chapters, like sometimes they're not like the most fun to write because there's usually not like a ton of action in them. It's usually just a lot of prose and a lot of like flowery language and like the building of the world itself, depending on like what it is you're trying to present to the audience through that filler chapter. But like they're necessary to the story to help you get sort of like a full rounded picture of it. Usually like it's because there's like a gap in one of those elements, especially like one of those elements that like I mentioned. For me, a lot of the times it's like the secondary characters, just because I know that's, especially when I'm drafting, sort of one of the things that I'm weakest on in like that drafting phase is I'm so focused on the story through the lens of my main character. Sometimes when I'm drafting, those like secondary characters will like fall to the wayside. And so that's what maybe I need a filler chapter to sort of like expound on the relationship between like my main character and another side character, or even some side characters to each other, different things like that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to hear too, in terms of even a filler chapter is not all useless, pointless information or extraneous. Even if it's fun, it's not extraneous. It has to serve at least one easy to point out or one recognizable purpose for your book. And even if the reader can't recognize that, it should go unnoticed as a useless filler chapter if you write it well. And I think something like you're talking about, filling out like an area of that's not as much as one of your strengths as a writer, that's a great strategy for a filler chapter. And especially as in terms of drafting, that you might feel motivated to write a filler chapter if just in your gut or as you're going by, you haven't even necessarily reviewed your whole entire draft, you know you need something. Yeah. And so even though it may feel like, oh yeah, you can, yeah, exactly. And I would almost argue that, yes, that fits the role of the filler chapter if it's something that, well, I met my overall plot, I did my overall book, maybe I've already finished my manuscript before this whatever deadline I might have, but I need this. And I would argue that typically as an author, there is a reason why that's there, even if you can't put your finger on it. And maybe as you go on later in the process, you'll get rid of that chapter if you don't end up finding that reason. But I think it's worthwhile to add that in, and it's worthwhile to put that filler chapter in so you have more material. And this kind of leads into one of the comments that Kyra put down in the chat. So how can you tell when world building is too excessive in filler chapters? And is there like weird pacing? Is there other things that come up? And my answer to this would be, especially for fiction, especially fiction in particular, I think you do feel some pacing issues in a filler chapter that's not really meeting its potential, and a filler chapter that's not really meeting its goal. Or if there's a filler chapter that maybe is meeting a goal, but it's, let's say in like your case with the secondary characters, it's such a strong POV pivot, and it's jarring, and it removes you from the overall arc of the story in such a way that's like, whoa, and it's not really a good whoa. I would say those are really like abstract feelings that you have as readers that point out this is an excessive filler chapter. And the job of editing past drafting later on is to be able to anticipate those. But the job of drafting earlier on is to err on the side of, wait a second, maybe I do need this. Let me put this in here and have this in my wheelhouse as something to determine and figure out later on in the process. So that would be my take. Filler chapters err on the side of including them in drafting.
I would say like along a similar thread. It's easier to see like those gaps, or in this case, like the excess, once you do have like that first draft and you can look back on it versus when you're sort of in the middle. And like, at least for me, like I will notice those things. Like you, again, it's sort of like a gut thing. You can kind of tell when the pacing is off or when something feels like it's too much or too little, especially the more you write, the more books you write. But for me, a lot of the times it's like my heavy pen readers that are the ones that sort of point that out to me because I love, and we've talked about this before, like I love the detail and the description, and sometimes I run a little bit too far down that direction. And so since I'm aware of that thing, I purposely tell like my heavy pen readers and my beta readers, like this is something I do, and like they know it. The ones that keep coming back, they know it, so they know to look for it. The new ones say like this is something I tend to do. This is something I want you to watch for, and sort of gut check for me if there's any place where you feel like this is too much, or on the flip side of that, like, or if you feel like there's too little, then maybe I need to like a little bit more. You need some more background information or world building information or whatever that is.
Definitely. And I think the key too is finding its way that it fits into the book with one of these chapters, or making it seamless and making it fit. And that's a vague term, but I think especially I've noticed actually in a lot of nonfiction books, a lot of history books that tend to feel very much so filled with filler chapters, which is weird when you're talking about research and stuff that's pertinent to an overall topic that's being explored rather than just a story. And all these things, well, that thing is true. That thing is an examination of something that actually happened. So of course it's important to what I'm trying to say with this nonfiction book. And I think a lot of nonfiction authors that I've read tend to fall into that trap. And it distracts from the overall point of the book. It's like, okay, what is the point of me reading this if you're just kind of regurgitating information to me that, yeah, it happened at this time or in this place or for this topic or this business topic or whatever your book is. But I think having it fit into the larger narrative and knowing why you've put it in will keep it from feeling too odd and too weird. And then ultimately it's your choice while editing to decide whether meeting that goal and having that chapter fill that purpose is actually worth the costs it might have in terms of the pacing or in terms of how it fits into the larger narrative. And you could say, well, that served a point, but it's too jarring. It's too, or it fluffs out this point, and I'm going to cut it. Or maybe I'm going to shorten it down. And that's something that you can decide a little later on. And another question that Kyra had that I kind of want to bring up now, because it does have to do with moving into different processes or different phases of the process of writing. How much of a break do you give yourself in between writing projects? And I want to expand this more to say, how much of a break do you give yourself after you're done drafting before you move into editing? And to be on theme with the ending of drafting. Emily, do you have a set break, or is it very much so just a gut check? Is there something that you've found as you've gone on? Because you've written more than I have. And I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, I'm like trying to think. I do take a break. I can't just jump from one project to the next, because once you go through the entire process, like, it's draining. And we talked about this, like, I think last time, of just like, you got to fill your creative well.
Yeah.
Even if, like, for my case, a lot of the ones that I've been working on, they're in the same world, it's the same characters, it's the same like overall story, but sometimes you just my jump from like Crimson Time to Fractured Past was probably about a month. I didn't give myself super long for that one. Partly it was because my readers, they were like, you can't end it like this, like, we need to know what happens next. I probably would have taken a little bit longer if it wasn't for that. But then I allowed myself to take a little bit longer. I probably took, honestly, like two to 3 months between like Fractured Past and like Veiled Scars. Partly because, like, again, you get sort of tired and like you need a break. You need sort of like a palate cleanser. And part of that for me was working on a different book. So like it's still like a creative like filling of the well, because it's a different story and I'm still writing. Yeah. So I took a break, but I was like still writing at the same time, just not for like my current series, for something different.
Right.
So I think it is definitely sort of like a gut check, but you do definitely have to, like, and this is perfectly on point with what we've been talking about. You have to give yourself a deadline for your break too, because it's very easy to say, oh, I'll start writing again tomorrow. And before you know it, like a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months have passed and the year's gone, or whatever that looks like. But yeah, I be intentional and like give yourself the breaks because you need them, but be intentional on the flip side of that, of like giving yourself a deadline for when those breaks will end. or when those longer breaks will end, I should say, because you can still take time while you're drafting or while you're editing or while you're revising or while you're going through all like the miscellaneous final steps of things you have to complete before you can actually publish that book. You'll still give yourself like those small breaks in between, but be intentional about like when you start and stop those. And if you have to, like, schedule them on a calendar.
Yeah.
That helps me a lot of the time. Just because I'm a very like visual person, I like to see like the span of like what's going on in my life. So I like to sort of like plot things on the calendar or whatnot. But like if I can see, like maybe I'm on a Wednesday and I'm just exhausted and I don't feel like I can write anymore today or even for the rest of the week. But then I see like, oh, I gave myself like a break for Friday night, and that's going to be my like popcorn and movie and a glass of wine kind of night for me. That gives me sort of the motivation again to be like, okay, like that break is going to be so much sweeter if I can finish this chapter, or if I can get 1,000 more words before I hit that break, or whatever that looks like. So yeah, I guess the long and short of it is like give yourself the breaks, but give yourself the deadlines, and you sort of have to use sort of like a gut check of what is best for you in both of those like scenarios.
Yeah. Oh, and I love something that you said earlier when you were talking about what exactly is a break, because I was working on this other project as part of my break. Yeah. And for me, that's what I kind of felt after finishing my book, just actually finishing the whole publishing process, was this sort of rundown where the whole week immediately after I was like, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm just going to write songs, which is something I never do. I'm not like musically inclined, and I never want to show anybody those. They're not good. But for me, it was just like I needed to write something that was just odd and urgent for what I'm doing. And that was really helpful. And then it was like, okay, maybe another 2 weeks. And then I started working on a short story. And then a while went by, I don't know how long, and then I worked on a script. And for me, it's been almost a year now, and I haven't started book 2, but that's because I'm, differently orienting my goals, and I don't necessarily want to have that immediately after. But for somebody who wants to be a continuous author and you want to keep putting out books on a schedule and a pace, having that deadline for, okay, 2 months went by, I need to start book 2. That's really important, because otherwise, if I was trying to get book 2 done in a certain amount of time and I wanted it out, I would have needed to set a deadline earlier, and I would have needed to have that started by now, if that's what I was working towards. And something tying back to just during the actual process, and you're like, whoa, I don't know. If say you're an author who's, I don't know about that far ahead. I don't even know how I'm publishing this thing. All I know is I'm drafting it right now. How long do I give myself before I move into whatever the next step is? Sometimes that's not exactly completely your choice, right? In a way, is if you're exploring different publishing options, that may take various lengths of time. But I know for us, we had a publishing experience that was at least very similar, because we had the same publisher. So I know that built in, after we finished drafting, there was maybe like a week or two before moving on to a first phase of editing that was more high level, gave yourself just a little rest, and then you come and look back at it on a high level. And then once you're done with that, then we had a whole month. And that month wasn't restful. It wasn't, it was go, 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 but that was in terms of marketing. That was a go, go, go on a different scale. And I was exhausted by the end of that, but it was like a different well was being tapped, to use your term. And I think there's something to that you can, even during your breaks, you can be productive in all these other ways. Yeah. But if you're so if it's in the same lane as to the massive thing that you've just done, whether it's finishing your entire book or whether it's drafting, you do need a bit of a break, and you do need to celebrate it as a thing that you've accomplished and finished. And that leads to sort of our last prepared question, is, are there any techniques in particular? Now, we talked about finishing up the actual process of writing and meeting a deadline, but are there any techniques for in the writing itself, in the actual structure of the draft? Are there techniques that you have for physically ending the book? Like, what is a good strategy for going about writing your last chapter or your last chapters while you're drafting?
I'm gonna sort of take this in a slightly different direction.
Please.
This, but I'm gonna spin it a little bit. Fact of just getting the draft done versus what a good ending looks like. But like one of the things I know that like really, really helps me, that sort of like unlocked this whole realm of like writing for me, even though I do work better in like a larger time frame, is to actually like split that time up into like smaller periods of work and then like rest. Especially like on the weekends when I can just like sit down and write all day if I want to, or need to if I'm like on a deadline. I sort of like treat it as like a day long or whatever that looks like writing sprint. So I'm sure there's like some sort of fancy name for this because it's like a scientific method or whatever. But I don't know it. So but basically what it is like you write for 20 minutes and you set that timer and set whatever like additional goals. So like within this 20 minutes, maybe I want to get like 200 words, or I want to finish chapter 5 or whatever that looks like. And you go for that 20 minutes and then you take a 5-minute break and then you just keep repeating that for as long as you need to finish maybe like what your overall goal is for like the day or the weekend or the night or whatever that looks like. It's really hard, even if you are like an episodic writer like I am, where you work better on those longer like chunks of time, to like sit and stare at your screen for that like 5-8 hours like time period. So like if you can bite size it and redirect your attention every so often when you have those 5-minute breaks to get up, walk around, use the bathroom, grab a snack, let your dog out, whatever you need to do. I feel like we as humans have like a tendency to be distracted. So it's almost like a purposeful time period to allow yourself to be distracted and do something else and then like return and keep repeating that. So like, again, like that's been super helpful for me. It might not work for you. It might, but give it a try and see if it does.
Yes, I love hearing that. And I couldn't agree more in terms of especially taking those purposeful breaks on a small scale. We talked about it on a large scale, but just on a small scale during the writing process to give your eyes and head a break from writing, typically on a computer, most authors these days. Yeah. Just even to chat to somebody. I had roommates when I was writing, and I'd turn and talk to somebody for 10 minutes, and then I'd write for an hour. It would be very helpful to have those. And then I don't know if you were already starting on it when your Wi-Fi cut out, I think, for a bit, but I didn't know if I cut you off or not. But basically, in terms of actually ending a draft, I'm curious to hear. We talked about writing in order, and I think we both said that we did sort of tend to write the book in order. And I know not all authors do. I know probably a majority do. But for the people who do write in order, and if they're ending on their last chapter, there's a particular kind of pressure, even just while you're drafting, to feel like, oh, I have to wrap this up well.
Yes.
Now, how did you deal with that kind of pressure? And how did your last chapter, at this point in the writing process, do you remember how that kind of went down for you?
Yeah. So of the 2 books that I've like written start to finish and now have published, I'm a little different in the sense that they both end with cliffhangers. So ending a book that ends on a cliffhanger, even though you're sort of teeing up what's next, you still have to bring a majority of what is going on to some situation, because if your audience doesn't feel satisfied or mostly satisfied at the end of the book, they're probably not going to pick up the next one, or they'll be at least a little more hesitant to pick up the next one, wondering like, am I just going to go through the same like emotional turmoil again, only to not feel fulfilled at the end of it. So that sort of too is like a gut check if you are going to end up writing an ending that is a cliffhanger. You can't just cliffhanger on anything because it feels super suspenseful and like, oh, it's a good moment, let's just stop the action here and like pick it up in the next one. Be very purposeful about weaving in and finding resolution to those threads that you've been pulling on for a while. And I would say especially on those threads that you didn't resolve in book want for you to leave that with another cliffhanger that your audience is like, well, now what? I guess it's
Gotcha.
like ending a book that's not on a cliffhanger. I haven't personally done that yet. But you still need some sort of wrap up and conclusion that is satisfying to your audience. You still have to tie up all of those loose threads, or as many loose threads as you can, especially the important ones. And usually when you're ending that book, you want a clear like resolution and like send off to the reader. Like it's almost like that, like they've been holding their breath like the entire story. So you want the ending to be like that final like sigh of relief that they can just like settle into, so that when they close the book, they feel satisfied, and then they can sort of just like mentally contemplate the entire journey that you like just brought them on. So I mean, usually it's some sort of like clever turn of phrase or like a bit of dialogue that's really punchy. But it's all about sort of finding, and again, it's sort of a gut check, finding that like that proper ending, because an ending a lot of the times is just as hard to like finish as it is to like start a beginning of a story. Like, what is the natural beginning? What is the natural end? Sometimes you know that before you start writing, but sometimes it's sort of a, as you get to your point where like this feels right. And that's something too that you can kind of have like a gut check with your readers and your beta readers of like, did you feel like satisfied as a reader? Like when you finished reading it, did you feel like there was any like loose that weren't tied up or anything that wasn't clear? So yeah, that was kind of like a very like answer. But
no, that's
covered everything.
That's interesting too, in thinking about it for series and for books in a series. And I know we talked about overall outlines for like a whole series and overall outlines just for a book or a manuscript. And regardless of what kind of book you're writing, and regardless of whether really you're an outlining author or not, whether or not you actually did decide what your ending is going to be beforehand, the actual act of writing that ending and drafting that ending, I should say, is typically pretty difficult, even if you thought you had an idea of what to do with it. And completely agree. So many different permutations in my head for my book about like what I was doing with it, and I didn't decide. For the longest time, I didn't have an ending that looked even remotely like my ending during the drafting process. My ending, as it was in the drafting process, changed so much as I went through editing. And I think just having a little bit of foresight to go, okay, let me turn the pressure off a little bit. I am wanting to do a good ending while I have it on this draft. I'm going to maybe show this manuscript to somebody. I'm going to maybe pitch it to people. But it will change. Something about this will change. And once I have a better mastery over what I've even written, once I'm further along in the process and I understand what chapters I have and I know it very intimately inside and out, my beginning and my ending can both be touched up. And maybe there's a new connectivity between the two that you find, or at least an awareness that you have over the whole entire book that's going to make your ending better later on in the process. So I think the first thing would be removing the pressure. And then honestly, my second piece of advice, and something that I didn't do that I kind of wish I had done that might have been helpful, is not avoiding the standard ending when you're drafting, at least. Yeah. Now, when your book's coming out, that's a different story. You want your book to be the best it can be. You don't want things to, you don't want to feel left like, oh, this is too standard. But in terms of, you need a placeholder, let's just say, or you need something that just is an ending for your book, for even your nonfiction book, even it's just, it's like, what is the ending? What is the natural feeling ending in this moment? Write that one first. Just give it a shot. If it's like, yeah, it's all leading to this, but nah, I don't want to do that. That's too easy. That's too basic. Give it a shot and at least just write it that way one time. And I would almost recommend, even if you are somebody who writes in order, not finishing your your drafting process right on ending that last chapter. I would maybe say, kind of pace it back a little bit. Maybe finish your last chapter a week before you've set your deadline, and give yourself another week of actual drafting in the manuscript to look, okay, how can I buff this out? And maybe a new idea will come to you to improve that ending. And this all starts to bleed together, and I understand that it's like a confusing scale of what's really drafting, when does it become editing? Because if you're not, like if you already wrote the ending and you're going back and changing things in the middle, isn't that just sort of like editing or rewriting? Yeah, maybe kind of. But in terms of like a phase of a larger process, Nate, you don't have to finish it right with the end. Maybe you don't have to align those two, the deadline and the last chapter, exactly. And I think for me that would have been helpful to know that and to not feel like those had to be the same thing, even if you are a in order writer. Yeah. Did you? I just one other quick question for you in terms of series. You got me interested in that as a concept and an idea. Is do you have certain awareness of threads? Like you're saying, you want to finish some of the threads of book 1 by the end of book 2, so that you can leave other things open ended and not have the reader feel like, okay, everything's open ended. Are there other threads that are in book 1 that you're like, I know I'm not resolving this, because I want that thread open until the very last moment of my last book, so that's the running through thread. Is that something that also was a factor in how you ended these books?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. There are definitely like some pretty big threads that like flow throughout the entire series, that one in particular I know like I can't answer until like book 3 or until because I still don't know if it's going to be 3 or 4 depending on how 3 ends. But yeah, I mean, you kind of have to, when you're writing a series, and we talked about this like whenever we talked about outlining whatever week that was. But like you have to have some semblance of like the overarching thing that you're building to, the overarching thread that like ties the series together. And usually that main thing isn't answered until the last book. Because if you answer it too soon, then there's the end of your story, unless you're able to sort of pick up on like another thread that you wove and like carry on what that actual theme or overarching thing was. So yeah, those are definitely things that like you'll need to know ahead of time. And I definitely had sort of an idea of when I was going to wrap up like the bigger threads, but some of the smaller threads just sort of like come to conclusion naturally and will like wrap up in and of themselves. As you're working towards that larger thread. Definitely.
That sounds so helpful for even authors who are just doing one book, because I'm hearing, a resolution and an answer, and saving that for the end. And eventually, no matter what book you're writing, you're going to have to give that in some way. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe more so what I was trying to say was not giving that while you're doing your drafting process, you're losing out on a good resolution or ending to work with later on in editing. So what I mean is, if you're trying to write a subversive ending that's ambiguous, that's a little more open-ended or more artistic, let's say, that doesn't have as much weight behind it if you don't, as an author or a writer, understand what the natural resolution or answer or ending is to your story in your book. And if you haven't at least written that in draft form, then you may not even really know that yourself. And you may not have even shown yourself that you know that. And if you're testing around with something that's a little less online with that, that's maybe great later on, and you have the resolution tied in a different way in your book. But earlier on, I recommend diving into that and giving that, especially even with nonfiction books, I would say as well, because you have to hammer your point home. You get to the end of that, and it's like, oh, okay. But realistically, this is sort of the end of the actual drafting process. You can even hear us today talking about editing and wanting to lean forward and further along the publishing process, wherever that leads you. And so we are not going to wrap up the series with this one just yet. We have one more live stream in which we'll be talking about the intro to self-editing in particular, and that could be self-editing if you're having a publisher or you're not having a publisher. We'll talk about that more as well. And we'll have a couple more Instagram Write With Me's on @manuscripts.ed if you want to check those out. And realistically, I'm thinking that there could be some follow-up videos, that pre-recorded videos that we do that expand different parts of the writing process beyond NaNoWriMo, beyond the drafting phase. So look out for those. We already have some as well over on Manuscripts, the YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. And Emily, thank you for talking with me about this. It's been amazing doing these the last 5 weeks. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. They're always fun.
All right, bye, everybody.
Good night.